Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for the California Consultation Series hosted by Circular Action Alliance, or CAA. My name is Frances Oni, and I will be moderating today's webinar. First, let's review today's agenda. Next slide, please. We will introduce our panelists, then we'll give an overview of CAA and SB 54. Next, we'll have a presentation on reuse and refill, followed by a Q&A period. We'll finish off today's webinar by reviewing important next steps. Next slide, please. With that, let's meet today's panelists. Emily Coven is CAA's California Executive Director. Sylvia Lee is the Reuse and Refill Director. Jody Tomchishin is a Policy Advisor, and Dave Lefebvre is Policy Advisor and Producer Engagement. Next slide. I want to highlight a few important reminders. Today's presentation is intended for informational purposes only. CAA is not a law firm and does not provide legal advice. If you need legal guidance, please consult with your own counsel. We want to underscore our commitment to compliance with federal and state antitrust laws. As participants, we need to avoid discussions around pricing, market allocation, or other topics that could create even the appearance of anti-competitive behavior. Next slide. One more, please. A few housekeeping notes. This webinar is being recorded, and both the recording and the slide deck will be available on CAA's California Consultation webpage. After today's webinar, you will receive a link to a questionnaire. We encourage you to complete it within 30 days, as your input is essential to shaping a practical and effective program plan. Please use the Q&A feature to submit your questions, and we'll address as many questions as possible during the Q&A portion of the webinar. All participants will remain muted throughout this session. CAA provides updates on program plan development at the Producer Responsibility Advisory Board meetings, which anyone can attend by registering on CalRecycle's website. Next slide. We encourage you to register and attend the final CAA California Consultation Series webinar. And now I'd like to hand it over to Emily Coven, CAA's California Executive Director. Emily.
Thank you, Frances. So I'm just going to give a quick overview of CAA and what our role is in this whole SB 54 adventure. So next slide, please. So for those of you who are not familiar with Circular Action Alliance, we're a nonprofit producer responsibility organization. We're founded by producers, and so you can see who those producers are on your screen here. And next slide. We are located all across the country. So CAA is a remote organization, which means that we've got people everywhere. And then we do have concentrations of people in states where CAA is active as the producer responsibility organization. The first state in the United States to go live with packaging EPR was Oregon earlier this year. Colorado is going to be the next state, and we are the third state here in California, and you can see that there's more states to follow. We also have a number of colleagues from Canada, and that's because Canada was ahead of the United States in terms of packaging EPR and has a lot of experience there. So we do have a lot of colleagues there that bring that knowledge into CAA. We're also really fortunate here in California that we weren't the first state like we often are in so many things. So we can learn from what's happening in Colorado and in Oregon, and those colleagues can help us out so that we're not always reinventing the wheel at every step. Although some things we are doing are new and out there, and certainly reuse refill is uncharted territory here in California. So next slide. In terms of what a producer responsibility organization is, we do a whole bunch of different things. You can see here that we are at the top of the wheel today, which is in our consultation and where we are engaging everyone who's attending today. Thank you for coming. We're meeting with communities and interest holders, and we're really trying to seek feedback from everyone who is possibly touched by SB 54 on how our program plan that we're developing is going to impact you. So it's super important that your voice is heard, and really ask that you take the time to fill out the questionnaires at the end of the webinars, including this one today. What we're working towards is a program plan, which is a giant document that we will submit to the state of California in June of 2026. That's going to detail all the ways that we are going to actually implement SB 54. Once that's approved, then we move into being up and running, and we set fees and collect fees from producers. Those fees are meant to incentivize packaging design changes, and then we use those fees to fund all sorts of different things. You'll hear, some of them will be reuse and refill systems. Also, the whole entire recycling system, improving that, end market development, education and outreach to support all these efforts. So you can see we're in the middle of a bazillion different interest holders, and this whole series is about making sure that the voice of everyone is heard and represented in our program plan. Next slide. One thing I just want to clarify real quickly, you can download this slide after the presentation and read through it in more detail, but at a high level, want to differentiate between what CAA does and what CalRecycle does. So we're really on the planning and implementation side of SB 54, whereas CalRecycle is the one developing the regulations. And then once we're up and running, they will have oversight over CAA. So it's a little hard to tell, who should I ask about what? So hopefully this will help a little bit. And in the meantime, we are doing some redirection back and forth. And sometimes we refer people over to CalRecycle, and sometimes they refer people back to us. But we're hoping that over the coming months and years, it will get more clear kind of who does what in the SB 54 universe. Next slide. So SB 54 in a nutshell, if you're not familiar with these targets, these are the big ones that we are working towards. The first two are sort of industry-wide, and therefore the obligation is on us as the producer responsibility organization. And those are to reduce single-use plastic reduce single-use plastic put into packaging by 25%, and 10% of that has to come from reuse, refill, or elimination, as you'll be hearing about today. And the other goal is to recycle 65% of single-use plastic. And these are of the covered materials, but that's the vast majority of it. The other big goal here is to ensure that 100% of all packaging sold in California is either recyclable or compostable. And that's an obligation that falls onto every single producer. So every producer is responsible for ensuring that that is true of their packaging. Next slide, please. Wanted to make a point of clarification here around what recyclable means in the context of when you're figuring out your packaging. So for the producers out there, as you're looking at your source reduction, want to be clear that you cannot meet your targets by shifting from packaging that's currently recyclable to packaging that's not recyclable, or packaging that's less likely to be recycled or composted. So the example down below is because currently rigid plastics are recycled at a higher rate than flexible plastics, that's not a source reduction conversion. You shifting over to a material that is more likely to be recycled or composted, that would fit the bill. Next slide. Where's my next slide? Okay. So in terms of what we're asking today for you all after this webinar, or in the month while the questionnaire is open, we're asking for ideas. We really need all the ideas we can get to pour into our program plan. We will take big ideas. We will take small ideas. We will take good ideas. We'll take bad ideas. We need all the ideas. We do need ideas to be sort of within the constraints that we have. So the first constraint we have is legal, regulatory, statute. There's, as the pro, we have to, stick within the bounds of SB 54. So there might be some great ideas that have nothing to do with SB 54. That's not something that we can put into our plan. We have the constraint of time. So everything we're building a 5-year plan. And so there's some great ideas that would take 20 years to implement. We can't do that within 5 years. So we're really trying to stick to kind of what's feasible within the timeframes we're operating on. Financial constraints, we don't have infinite funds to spend, so we have to be very cost efficient where we are deploying these fees that we're collecting. And then we are, of course, still operating in a good deal of uncertainty The primary uncertainty being we don't have final regulations, but we're hoping that happens soon. So that's kind of just so you know, kind of the boundaries within which we are operating as you send us your ideas. And finally, next slide, just a quick comment about the state of California. If you haven't heard me say this before in a prior webinar, thank you for coming. Thank you for caring about what's happening in California. California is really staged to have really a huge impact in the packaging EPR world. By the time our program is up and running, we will have the single largest packaging EPR program on the planet. Not only that, not only will it be the biggest, not only do we have 40 million people who will be affected here inside California, but what we do will have a lot of impact on the rest of the country. So, you know, as we work, for instance, today on reuse refill, that is going to be looked at a lot by a lot of other places, seeing can we replicate that in our states as well. So your input really is going to have an impact beyond the boundaries of this state, because I keep hearing like all eyes are on California, the world is watching California. So it's a privilege to be here. It's a privilege to have this opportunity to deploy this amazing program in the state of California. And thank you for your participation in making sure that we do it as best as we possibly can. So with that, I will hand it over to Sylvia to walk you through reuse and refill.
Great. Hello, everyone, again. My name is Sylvia Lee. I'm the Director of Reuse and Refill, and I'm presenting on behalf of the CAA team. The goals of today's presentation are to communicate the ambition of California's reuse, refill, and elimination targets, to share the story of our learning journey, and to discuss examples, pros, cons of the potential building blocks to achieve those RRE targets. As Emily alluded to, the California targets necessitate change on a scale that's never really been attempted before. The numbers that you see here are from the Accenture Waste Baseline Study for Cal Recycle, and they don't represent the numbers that will eventually form the 2023 baseline of the baseline supply for just the CAA producers. However, they do serve as CAA's estimates for the time being. And as you can see, by 2032, these estimates suggest that in order to hit the RRE targets, it will be necessary to convert over 290,000 tons of single-use plastic and to convert over 17 billion components of single-use plastic. Furthermore, producers have essentially 5 years to reach the target, from the start of 2027 in the green block to the end of 2031. If we assume over here in the left-hand corner that regulations will take effect in early 2026, CAA will need to aim for a deadline of March 2026 for producers to submit their individual source reduction plans, because through those plans, CAA will learn directly from the producers what they believe they can contribute to the overall source reduction target. And that will enable CAA to in turn finalize our reuse refill investment strategy by mid-2026 to submit along with the program plan. From there, producers have universally given us feedback that packaging changes to reuse refill can take anywhere from 1 year on the simpler side to 3 years on something much more complex. Coming from the outside, it might seem like that black arrow, the producer packaging change, seems really long, but in reality, it takes time to search and qualify a new packaging vendor. If there's new equipment involved to fill the product into the new packaging, then there's delivery timeline, installation timeline, there's ramp-up trials of the new equipment. And in parallel, there's a lot of consumer testing happening, especially if the package helps pour the product or if the packaging helps apply the product, as well as artwork development. Back when I worked in antiperspirants, one of the really long lead time items was something called shelf life or stability testing to ensure the quality and the safety and basically the stability of an item to stay on shelf for 1 to 2 years. And if you've ever seen like a really puffy, turgid bag of potato chips in a high altitude city, a ship test was performed to make sure that bag didn't burst when it was traversing the mountains. And then on top of all this, there's usually a sell-in process that requires producers to commit to a new product some 6 to 9 months ahead of launching, and that allows the retailers to build in their plans and planograms to help reset their shelves. So when it comes to reuse, one of our learnings that you'll hear ahead of us is that there is going to likely be a need to align on standard packaging that then many producers are going to have to go back to their own organizations to test and do all those things that I talked about. So when you see that overlap in the time frame between convening industry groups and agreeing on a packaging and the actual packaging itself, these activities are clearly going to be challenging on the timeline that we're going to be on. I'll also mention that there's a relatively narrow definition of what qualifies for reuse and refill in California. So, for example, one of the top items that Europe's Packaging and Packaging Waste Regulation Act, that's the PPWR, is targeting is transport packaging. And unfortunately, converting from wooden pallets to reusable pallets would not count in California because only source reduction from plastic counts. Another top item in the top right corner that Europe's PPWR is targeting is beverages. And unfortunately, most beverages are part of California's bottle deposit system and are thus out of scope. And as mentioned earlier, converting from a recyclable item such as this rigid single-use milk container, which, by the way, is one of the beverages that is not part of the California bottle deposit system, to a non-recyclable or less recyclable plastic film bladder of milk that goes into the milk dispenser would not be allowed. What would qualify as reuse and refill are some of the following models. So on the bottom right is the most straightforward one, but likely the rarest one, which is a conversion from single-use plastics to a B2C retail pre-filled returnable. The most common one in the market today is likely what you see in the top left-hand corner, which we call refill at home. So this is where you have package B, something that is like a hand soap dispenser sitting on your sink, with package A, the large jug of hand soap sitting, in your, behind, on the bottom of your sink in a jug. With respect to that model, it is the parent package B that counts toward reuse refill because that's the one that's being refilled. There's variations of this model, such as the component reuse and refill model. And again, it's the component that is being used multiple times. So it's the component's weight and the component's weight that is going to be counted toward reuse and refill. And on the top right-hand side, there are producer-managed durable food serviceware items that might be washed, like a mug, on site or potentially contracted with a washer, third-party washer that is then being returned back into the supply for many, many cycles. That would be considered reuse and refill. However, note that any bring your own container similar durables, like a consumer bringing their own travel mug to get coffee from their favorite coffee shop, would be considered elimination and not reuse and refill under California guidelines. Over the last 6 or 9 months, CA has been on a learning journey assessing the landscape of reuse and refill. So with our partners, Eunomia and Perpetual, we conducted a landscape scan of what was happening globally, as well as what is already existing in California. We studied reuse and refill activities that were happening in Canada, in France, Netherlands, the UK, and so on, as you can see on the left, as well as reviewing pilots such as the Consumer Goods Forum Reuse Cities, which is slated to launch home care and personal care B2C in-store refillables next year. Circular Innovation Council launched some reusable takeout container programs also in Ottawa, and many more. And while studying efforts in Canada and Europe are really insightful, California's requirements, as already kind of touched on, will make it more challenging to meet. I don't think I need to belabor the point, but shifting from any materials counts in most European countries, only shifts from plastic count in California. Existing B2B and B2C efforts qualify for targets in Europe, only shifts since 2023 count in California. So ultimately, there's no proven and like straightforward kind of pathway for California. There's certainly a history of reuse in some relatively niche areas like returnable beer containers, and we've all been to restaurants where we eat on ceramic plates and have metalware. But for the most part, the community is still learning. It's still mostly small scale pilots. For example, the one that I mentioned in Ottawa with the takeout containers was launched at 8 restaurants and supermarkets with an inventory of 5,000 containers. Compare that to the target ahead of us in California for 2032 of 17 billion components, and you can see the scale of which California is trying to achieve. But there are some great takeaways, including the fact that closed loop and shorter supply chains can transition more quickly, the fact that washing infrastructure is dictated by container shape, like wide mouths are different than the equipment needed for narrow necks where the swivel head needs to go inside to clean, and by levels of hygiene, like food hygiene has a higher necessity for hygiene versus maybe just on-person contact versus like laundry detergents, which don't really contact like a person or go inside you as an ingestion. And then lastly, that alliances are going to be very important to enable the alignment on standards and on pooled and shared packaging that would really help with the scale and efficiencies that we are going to be looking for in order to pack the truck efficiently, to batch similar containers, to go into the wash line, and to basically have a pool of inventory so that it can get to the right producer or the right place just in time. Next on the learning journey was the work, again, by Eunomia Perpetual to assess which type of packages were making up the California tonnage and components, and mapping those to what type of potential reuse and refill solutions were possible. So in the typical linear economy, in the blue circles, new packaging enters on the left. It is filled, then transported to a distribution center, then transported to a restaurant or retailer before being purchased by us, the consumer. We consume the product and then we usually put it in the trash or the recycling bin. In the reusable economy, after we, the consumer, finishes the product, these need to be returned to a central collection point, which is then transported to a sorting center, then transported to a wash hub where it is washed, dried, packaged, and then transported back to be refilled. And then the cycle repeats, hopefully many, many times. We learned that it's possible to classify the many types of reuse and refill models on this spectrum of infrastructure intensity from requiring less infrastructure on the left to requiring a lot of heavy-duty infrastructure on the right. And we'll go through these groupings. So from the left, the first group is what is called packaging-enabled solutions. And an example of this is what I had covered a little bit before, the refill via single-use packaging type products. So having a refill via a tray insert for cosmetics or maybe some facial moisturizer, or what I mentioned before via the like refill at home with a large jug underneath your sink and the sink top hand soap dispenser. With this type of model, the advantages are that the producers can independently transition and independently pursue this because there is no shared infrastructure happening. But unfortunately, it's estimated that there's very little tonnage. Only 0.3% of single-use plastic can leverage this type of solution. But it's still helping to rebuild this important refill habit. Another area that producers can pursue independently is the elimination pathway. And the example here is to eliminate the film wrapping outside a big broccoli head. Or again, this bring your own cup to your favorite coffee shop. Again, producers can pursue independently. No shared infrastructure is required. Unfortunately, it's unknown how much tonnage is going to be in this area until producers submit their individual source reduction plans, which we will gain visibility to in the spring of 2026 to see how much this area can potentially contribute to those RRE targets. The second grouping of reuse refill solutions consists of what is termed infrastructure-enabled solutions, where additional equipment is needed, but importantly, the reusable item stays within a defined boundary in what the industry terms a closed loop. Here, the examples are, for example, like a large venue, like a stadium or a theme park, where there might be a little bit of movement around, but ultimately, which can be, the food serviceware item can be secured with a deposit, but ultimately the consumer will return the item to a central collection point, which is highlighted in the orange circle before leaving the theme park or before leaving the stadium. Another example of this is in cafeterias, at schools, at hospitals, at workplaces. The nuance here is that deposits might not be needed because the reusable item is returned before we leave the room. And lastly, a very similar scenario is smaller venues, but the dine-in portion of quick service restaurants. The pros here, the advantages here are that the activity, all this kind of like using, forks, knives, clamshells, bowls, are contained within a single site, which means high return rates are really possible here. Unfortunately, though, after large venues are converted, the tonnage becomes pretty fragmented, as there are tens of thousands of establishments in which CA has relatively little sphere of influence over. But still, the promise of this area is the opportunity to build the habit in the next generation. So just imagine if each K through 12 child in California is using and returning reusable food serviceware in their school cafeteria, 180 school days a year. Then that future consumer behavior that we're looking forward to in terms of bringing a dirty empty a little further than your cafeteria collection point is just going to be that much more ingrained. Then there is a third grouping consisting of system-enabled solutions. There's a type A, which I called collect from business, and then there's a type B, which is collect from the consumer. We'll go over A first. So B2B back of house pre-filled returnables. This is an area that does require those wash hubs, those shared wash hubs and shared infrastructure to be in place. But if you notice in the orange circle, the packaging doesn't ever reach the consumer. It's kind of bouncing back between the distribution center and like the retailer operator and then back to the distribution center. And the pros of this model is, in fact, that the dirty empties don't reach the consumer. They're collected on site, so really high return rates are possible. There might even be the potential for the same trucks that deliver the 5-gallon bucket with the peeled potatoes to take it back. Details definitely need to be worked out, as there's probably hygiene issues to be considered, but there's some possibilities. The cons of this particular model is that it's super convenient and invisible to the consumer, but for the retailer, the material flow on their floor is going to be different, and the place to stack and store these dirty empties are going to need to be identified. And when it comes to restaurants and food service areas, there's just not a lot of space in these particular places. I'm going to share a case study, Euro plant tray, just to kind of illustrate the typical kind of like alliance type activity that takes place over the number of years before getting to a place of identifying a few standard formats to then launch. So Europlant Tray was an alliance initiated in Europe by 2 flower growing organizations, 3 flower wholesalers, and 2 home improvement retailers. That's the Hornbach and the OBI. It took 3 years of alliance building and designing and business model thinking. For example, they issued out a survey to 400 of their growers and wholesalers seeking to understand how much sales volume goes into like certain flower pot sizes and what are the dimensions of your flower pots. And are there special considerations like super tall orchids that, might tip the pot over? Do the trays need to retain water during transport? These are all the types of small details that need to be aligned on in order to get to like 4 standard tray formats. And of course, they're developing more, but they landed on 4 to start. And then they had to think about how to attach an RFID tag. And these ended up being made of plastic and specifically intended to melt and be molded directly into the trays, which conveniently enables a lot of features that they were looking for, like labels that don't get moldy, labels that are UV resistant and water resistant during any sort of kind of wash cycle. So after 2 to 3 years of planning, these were launched in market. The cost of a single-use plastic tray, what they used to be in, is typically around 27 cents. With crowdfunding, they were able to drop the price of the reusable tray, which is $2, down to 63 cents, which is now rented in 3 or 5 year leases by these member organizations. And that's what enables these reusable plant trays to cost less than the single-use plant tray at the fourth cycle. So 1% market share of nursery plant trays were achieved in that first year of launch, saving 1,000 tons. In comparison, California's 2032 targets are to convert 290,000 tons. I would call this modest complexity collected on site at Hornbach and OBI. Typically, I understand there's no washing involved and there's no refilling of product. There's refilling, of course, of the flower pots, but it's different than filling of product. The fourth grouping are system-enabled solutions that are collected from the consumers. The key distinction here is that the reusable item moves from the retailer into the consumer's homes. And so that means two things. One, the consumer has to prefer the reusable versus the single-use option at the shelf. And two, after they finish consuming the product, they need to return the empty packaging to a central collection point. The pros here are the incredible potential for scale. Just converting a single reusable SKU has the potential of reaching thousands, possibly millions of consumers. However, this does require the most complex infrastructure, as you see in that orange highlight, including the thousands of consumer collection points to retrieve the dirty empties, a significant sorting center because it's likely that many different sizes and many different shapes of packaging are going to be involved, wash hubs, and ultimately transportation back to either a co-filling, co-packing plant or potentially even back to the producers. And this brings us to the case study of Citeo France, which is the largest in-store returnable initiative in the world right now. It extends the case study that you heard from your Euro plant tray even further because it took a steering committee 4 years of work sprints, pitching retailers to join the pilot, aligning on which products they were going to start with, food and beverage in this case, aligning on these 5 standard containers, testing the containers, building the economic model, contracting with the washers, the sorters, the transporters, and building the IT infrastructure to track the inventory and the ownership of the deposit as the items go around from retailer to consumer to the collection point to the warehouse to the washer. It's all has to be tracked because these shared pools are going to be allocated, back to where there is an inventory shortage or need. So this initiative launched in June of 2025 in Northwest France with 2 of those 5 standard glass packages with a starting inventory of 300,000 bottles. Again, in comparison to California's 2032 targets to convert 17 billion components to reuse and refill. All right, so then there's takeaway reusable food serviceware. Very similar to the model that I just mentioned, consumers are also taking home these kind of like takeout containers back home, eating them, and then needing to return them to a central collection point, as highlighted in the orange circle. The challenge here is that there's definitely potential to potentially partner with like some top fast food chains with some ability to scale. But other than that, there are an estimated 60 or 90,000 restaurants in California. So that is a lot of restaurants to onboard. However, I think in some good news, like the reusable takeout containers is a really fast cycling item. After all, you're eating it that night and probably like done with it, which will really help drive volume through collection points and reverse logistics. And that helps complement the previous model, which is typically, B2C retail pre-filled returnables. We're talking about shampoos or even condiments, that takes longer than eating a takeout, for the night. So in summary, there are various ways to kind of like view a reuse and refill model. For example, and I've got kind of easier on the left and harder on the right. Like we know consumer adoption is going to be challenging with respect to some of these models. The easiest one is probably the B2B pre-filled returnables because again, the consumer does not interact with that 5-pound pail of peeled potatoes. It's going back and forth between the restaurant and the distribution center. Consumer never sees it. But if you look at the next line from a retail disruption, that same green block is on the highest end of disruption because that restaurant's kitchen probably doesn't have a lot of space. And now they have to find where to stack the empty dirties and they have to worry about food hygiene and arrange for it to be backhauled. We also know that the clock is ticking and there isn't a lot of time. So on the third line item where it says timeline to launch low on the left-hand side, on-site reusable food serviceware is relatively short lead time because you only need, hopefully, to negotiate with one location at a time. And there's far fewer decision makers than in some of these multi-producer, multi-retailer alliances. But on the next line down, you see scale economies, and it is, again, tens of thousands of restaurants to onboard, potentially one at a time. Lastly, we know that there's a lot of tonnage and components to convert in California, and on the scale economies side, on the left, B2C pre-filled returnables. I've mentioned how just converting or aligning on a few of these standardized SKUs could really result in thousands or millions of people getting them in their hands. But on the right-hand side, that is definitely the model that requires the most system infrastructure. Think about all those thousands and tens of thousands of collection points, the most time in terms of alignment, and the most consumer behavior change in terms of preferring it at the shelf and taking it back to a collection point when it's dirty and empty. So ultimately, what might be possible within the program plan period is summarized in terms of our best thinking at this point. From the left, from refill via single-use packaging, our partners, Eunomia and Perpetual, have estimated the potential products that could leverage this route at 0.3% of total tonnage. Elimination is not here. I've already mentioned how that is going to be unknown tonnage until we receive information from the producers and their individual source reduction plans in mid-2026. On-site reusable food serviceware, unfortunately, some of the tonnage here is likely not addressable. For example, included in this category are single-use plastics for personal consumption or for personal events. So technically, it's dine-in and closed loop, but it's not likely that your family or my family are going to buy 20 extra durable dishes or contract with a washer to host your toddler's third birthday party. Another example of tonnage in here is correctional institutions. There's a fair amount of single-use plastic tonnage in those locations, but more durable food serviceware might not be welcome in that environment. So in any case, if CAA puts a concerted effort into converting the high majority, we're talking 75, 80+% of every California stadium, theme park, airport, train station, mall food court, college, K through 12, hospital, workplaces, on, any closed loop kind of environment, it might be possible to reach 4.3% of total tonnage. With B2B and B2C pre-filled returnables, I've already talked about how the opportunity for scale is great, but the runway to launch something meaningful is incredibly short. Takeaway reusables, if we can make a strong push with fast food chains, maybe all the fast food chains, all the quick service restaurants in a few specific cities or geographies where we can really drive density to enable some sort of central collection point system to work, that can potentially reach another 1.6% of tonnage. So that doesn't quite get us to 10%, but don't forget these are all estimated numbers from the Accenture baseline study. CAA will start learning in the spring of 2026 what the actual tonnage of our set of producers are, and we will definitely be looking into opportunities to further penetrate into reuse or further accelerate some of the sectors to come on earlier. So to recap, CAA is thinking about 3 potential building blocks toward this reuse and refill and elimination strategy. Building block 1 is refill at home and elimination, where the producers can pursue independently, and we will find out more in the spring of 2026 from their individual source reduction plans. Building block 2 is closed loop. So this is the on-site reusable food serviceware. CAA will lead this. We hope to get a better lay of the land by spring 2026 by issuing RFIs to understand what capabilities and services already exist in California and how we can integrate that into our thinking. And then building block three is what I term everything else. We will start assessing interest in like sector specific pre-competitive alliances. And as I've kind of already mentioned, these will take a couple of years, launch potentially two to five standard formats at a time, and we will look for opportunities to accelerate some of these. All right. In terms of next steps, we will continue to await the California Needs Assessment, which is due January 2026. We'll definitely keep learning and studying with all of our partners about what type of capabilities are out there to help us ultimately submit the California program plan in June of 2026. I just wanted to mention before opening up to Q&A, this is the last slide on my side, that in the questionnaire that follows, there are going to be asks for advice, lessons learned, any connections and leads out there. If you have capabilities or core service offerings in the area of reuse, if you are an expert in a specific supply chain or represent an alliance of producers in a specific sector or an alliance of California jurisdictions, please let us know if you would be interested in potentially responding to a request for information from CAA. And then lastly, there are some specific questions for local governments in terms of the status of reusable foodware ordinances and some questions for producers that will aid CAA in our planning. So let's open it up to Q&A now.
Thank you, Sylvia. As a reminder, please put your questions into the Q&A. We have many questions already, and we will get to as many as possible. And with that, let's turn it over to Dave.
We do have a lot of questions, Sylvia. Nice work on the presentation, and super excited to already have a bunch of questions that we can answer. To start things off, I thought I would start with some foundational questions. There were a few questions that we covered, but I want to make sure everybody's on the same page and that everybody has the information that they need to have a really fruitful discussion here. Because I think we have almost 20 minutes that we can answer questions. So the first question, and I'll take it, is just, is there a definition for single use? And I'm going to point our listeners and our audience to the PRC, so the Public Resources Code 42041, and then sections S and sections A and F. And so in order to truly understand what single use is, you almost have to read both of those together. S is the definition of packaging, and then A and F is the definition of reusable. And so together you get a sense of what is single use and then what would qualify as reusable. That said, we are very busy working on some guidance, and we will be able to provide some additional information and additional detail about what exactly producers can and cannot claim as their reuse and refill and elimination activities. Having dealt with that one, I am going to go to a question, Sylvia. One of the people asked, what does HORECA stand for? So on one of the slides, there was the word HORECA. I think we had a little footnote in the bottom, but
it was very small.
maybe not. Yeah.
It's hotels, restaurants, cafe, and catering. So it's like the food service industry.
Perfect. And then somebody else asked, are paper cups, example, coffee or fountain drinks considered part of this? And absolutely, they are covered by SB 54, and absolutely the person who wrote that indicates that there is a thin plastic liner. That is correct. That plastic liner would indeed qualify for source reduction if you make a shift out of that. Sylvia, does reuse and refill requirement apply to plastic? Can we develop a reuse refill program for pallets and cardboard? Now, I know you covered this, but we got more than one question about pallets. So can you just clarify for everyone, what does source reduction cover? Does it cover pallets? Does it cover cardboard?
So let me see if I understand the question. If there is a shift to reusable pallets from what, I guess is the question.
From wood pallets.
From wood pallets. So an organization can definitely shift into like reusable products, and then they wouldn't be paying for those like reusable products, but it would not count since the shift from wood to plastic will not count towards source reduction targets.
Very good. Uh, One of the people in the audience said, what do you consider high return rates? And what is a low return rate?
Hmm.
Maybe just speak to
So
the averages that you've
yeah,
seen
yeah, yeah,
in your
yeah. So
landscape.
I'm trying to think about context. I mean, I would typically say, because I'm just trying to think of the context in which I kind of talked about it. So within like a closed loop environment, like within a cafeteria, I would certainly hope like 95%, 98% type return rates are what I consider high and what I think would be almost the norm. I think those environments have proven over and over that those type of high return rates can be achieved. When it comes to the open loop, I think there's more of a question mark in terms of what those return rates can be achieved. The Petaluma Cup project has published their kind of pilot from last year. They achieved a 51% return rate. The Ottawa reuse initiative that I talked about, that was in 8 supermarkets and cafes. My understanding is that they achieved 95% return rates. That was linked to what is considered a delay penalty model. So you don't pay a deposit up front. But if you do not return in 14 or 30 days, I can't remember, then it was, I think, 5 or 10 Canadian dollars linked to your credit card or your bank account. So those are some of the considerations that kind of like drive return rate, whether a deposit is secured, whether it's upfront or maybe delayed, whether there's like item serialization to kind of like get to exactly where that item is and to potentially even be able to call the person like afterwards. Those are some of the things that drive return rates.
Okay, let's give Sylvia a break. We'll go to Jody. Can you clarify what counts as elimination? In the broccoli example, if I remove the plastic wrap and replaced it with fully recyclable paper bag with no plastic, then is it still considered elimination? Or does it have to be remove the plastic and not be replaced with any other plastic package or any
That's
packaging?
a that's a great question. And California is kind of unique in how it's regulated the difference between reuse, refill, and elimination. So they've been very explicit in the PRC. It's definition number J in the same section that Dave had mentioned before. And elimination means, and I'll just read it to you, the removal of a plastic component from a covered material without replacing that material with a non-plastic component. So no taking just the plastic off your broccoli and replacing it with a paper covering would not count as elimination. That would be considered material switching. But in the reuse, when we think about reuse refill, we often think about BYOC. And so in the BYOC example, that would be me selling product without packaging. So a consumer is bringing their own mason jar into a bulk store or their own container into a refillery, or they're taking their own travel mug into a coffee shop. They're purchasing product without the producer providing packaging. And so that would also be an example of elimination.
Very good. Sylvia, out of those 300,000 glass bottles in France, how many made it through the reuse refill system in the first year?
So they have not reached the first year yet because this launched in June of 2025. I think the whole reuse community is very eagerly awaiting a report out from Citeo to understand what the return rates are looking like, how the project is going, what their next steps are. We are in touch with them, and they have mentioned that January or so, spring of 2026, is when they're going to start reporting out some of the metrics.
Very new still. I think that was the
It
point
is
of one
very
of the
new.
slides that or in our landscape scan, most of it is pilots, and the biggest one is still just getting started. So we're all in the same boat together, trying to get these things going. There was an important question that I'm going to address very early on. So it was a comment more than a question. It said, you cannot get groups of companies together to agree on what types of packaging to use. This is an antitrust violation. Understand that it might have been misspoken, but CAA needs to be sensitive to that. And I just want to make it very clear to everyone who is listening. Absolutely. We are extremely sensitive to the concerns of antitrust and to making sure that we follow all of the antitrust laws. We understand the importance of it. And if and when we choose to convene a group of people to help us move this file forward, we will absolutely be thinking about making sure we have the right protections in place, that we have legal guidance in place, and that we are following all of the appropriate laws. At the same time, we have very ambitious targets, and there will need to be some conversations around the different packaging choices that exist. So believe us, we are aware there are concerns.
Dave, I'll just add, because we shared the Europlant tray case study. They started as an alliance, I think I mentioned, of 7 flower growers associations, retailers. They eventually evolved to an LLC specifically because they were sensitive to being on the borderline of competition and antitrust issues. So they evolved their, I don't know what you call it, organization structure in order to continue to comply.
Helpful, helpful. And of course, different laws everywhere, but we are trying to learn from every single place that we possibly can. And we have a very, very good, if not, I think he's like one of the best lawyers in all of the United States, working with us here at CAA. So I'm very excited. How will you document the difference between consumer supplied refill solutions and producer retailer supplied solutions? Jody.
So Dave, that is a great question, and it's not one that we have an answer to yet. What the statute requires us to do is to like require producers to report to us on the 5 source reduction pathways, and elimination is certainly a separate pathway from reuse refill in terms of the information that producers have to report. So if a coffee shop is selling product into a travel mug, that is elimination. If they're selling product into packaging that they have provided that is reusable, refillable, that goes into the reuse refill pathway. And our job as CAA is to provide guidance to make sure that they are reporting into those pathways separately. But I imagine that producers will come up with their own ways of measuring how they sell product within their own retail environments. But we are still early in writing our source reduction guidance. So if you have any advice on how we might be able to do that in terms of providing better guidance, we are all ears.
Indeed. I don't know if we're early. I would say that we are well on the way to writing our source reduction guidance, and it will be forthcoming. But absolutely agree with all of that. Let's see. Sylvia, what happens if a producer proposes to plan to reduce plastic and then is unable to commercialize due to technical challenges and needs to adjust their plan after the submission deadline? Actually, maybe I should take this question. So we are still, as much like the guidance and what Jody said, we are still very much working on what our approach is going to be to the individual source reduction plans that producers are going to need to submit. We will be updating all of our producers on that in the next, I would say, month or two. And so producers will have a very clear picture of how those individual source reduction plans work, what they are in fact committing to, and what their options are in terms of adjusting those individual source reduction plans. There's still a lot of work that we need to do. We need producers to submit their data. We are really hoping that producers will submit their baseline supply data by November 15th. All of the work that we are doing around source reduction and reuse and refill heavily depends on data, and we are data poor right now. So we would do well if we had a good critical mass of producers reporting in November, and then the remainder of them can report after the regulations take effect. That will help us figure this out a little bit better. Let's see. Will CAA consider hiring reuse and refill advocates to help restaurants and grocers to convert to reuse and refill systems? Or are all these businesses expected to figure this out on their own? Sylvia.
It's certainly going to take a large effort, as I think I've hopefully made the case for. I'm not sure what is what is the definition of like a reuse advocate. But as I think about how this could potentially roll out, I certainly hope that we would be in close connections with potentially like jurisdictions like cities or counties. And hopefully we'll even be able to work to the point where there is a phased plan. So first phase, we're going to like go after the biggest stadiums, the biggest theme parks, the biggest venues. Phase two, we're going to go after like colleges and universities. Phase three, workplaces and hospitals. Phase four, K through 12. Phase five, restaurants. I certainly hope there is going to be some sort of coordination like that. And yes, absolutely. I do think a big part of the effort is going to be maybe advocates. I've kind of thought about in my mind as like change management, kind of like technical services. There's many instances of reusable foodware micro grant kind of programs that already exist out there. One of the learnings I've heard from talking to them is that giving the grant of like $600, $800, here's a dishwasher, here's like reusable food serviceware, pales in comparison to the staffing time and the change management time it takes to kind of like lead these organizations, lead these establishments into kind of like a new kind of like operational procedure. Where like walking the floor, where do you put the bin? Where can you order the foodware from? And then that first day of launch, maybe even the first week of launch, can you imagine? Like I've heard like PTA groups kind of going in and leading the kids into kind of like what their new kind of process for going through the cafeteria line is. So certainly there's going to be manpower involved.
For that. Just looking at the time, I'm going to try to squeeze in a couple of questions here. I'm going to answer one of them, and then I'm going to go to Sylvia for potentially the last, if not the before last. I'm going to try to condense your question, Erica. Essentially, you're saying, does the reuse and refill system need to be up and measurable by 2027? So in relation to your question, it's important to first understand that the 2027 target is measured on 2026 supply. So whether or not CAA achieves the 10% source reduction, of which 2% must be reuse and refill by 2027, will be measured based on what producers do between Jan 1, 2026 and December 31st, 2026. That is the most important thing for people to understand. It's the same thing come the 2030 target. It is measured on the supply from the previous year. So everybody needs to be thinking about that as they are structuring their plans for individual source reduction. Let's go to this question here for Sylvia. Does the refill at home have a workaround? So it doesn't seem like it would require a refill container to be used. Anyone could still purchase the countertop soap container over and over rather than purchasing a large refill container under the sink. How does this work?
So in the source reduction guidelines that Jody has mentioned that we are working, there are likely going to be attestations that ask for producers to cite what volume is actually sold in like the parent or the child, or maybe not sold, but be prepared to have the evidence to back it up in case there is a spot audit check. So there does need to be some logic to kind of ensure that there isn't I don't know what you call it, like this system where people are only buying kind of like the parent. There needs to be some sort of comparison between this is the volume of large jugs that have been sold versus the volume of kind of like the sink top hand soaps. And if you're converting over how much volume actually refilled into like the parent sink tops, that's what you're going to be able to count as like the source reduction, not just the millions of sink top soap dispensers that have been sold, because that's likely what's been in the market for the last 10 years, 20 years. So of course, there's going to be a lot more volume in that area.
Very good. Francis is here. That must be our cue.
That is our cue. If we can move to the next slide, please. Thank you all for joining us today. We appreciate your time and participation. The next step is to provide your feedback. Your feedback is very important in developing a robust and effective plan for achieving California's ambitious recycling and packaging waste reduction goals. Please complete the questionnaire using the link provided in the chat. You will also find a link to the questionnaire in an email following this webinar, or you can access the questionnaire by using the QR code on your screen. To do that, simply open the camera app on your smartphone or tablet, point your camera at the QR code on the screen, and then tap the link that pops up. That will take you directly to the questionnaire. Please submit your responses by 11:59 p.m. Pacific time on December 4th. We look forward to receiving your input. Next slide, please. You can stay up to date by following us on social media, visiting our website, or emailing us at info@circularaction.org. Thank you again for your time today.